Okay, so why I want to show you this is because we are going to be talking about feminism today, much more importantly, and the fact that, a lot of feminist thinking, a lot of work that women do and labor that women do in movements, in academic work, in activism, in all of those things are usually left out of our story. So this is largely to kind of frame some of the questions and debates. And one of the things you see is that, Sojourner Truth is raising key questions around the idea of woman and what it means to be a woman. Because often in nationalist movements, as we'll speak about, women, even though they're included in very particular ways. So she's kind of trying to undo, and really amazingly progressive questions are being asked by her. So we'll just...
Here in the Black Abolitionist Sojourner Truth.
It's Alfred Woodard redoing it.
Slavery in 1827 speaks to a gathering of feminists in Akron, Ohio in 1851.
Well, children, well, there is so much racket there must be something out of kilter. I think twixt the Negroes of the South and the women of the North, all talking about rights, the white man will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helped me in a carriage, or over a mud puddle, or gives me the best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted. I can work as much. No man can head me. I gathered in the barns, and ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I get it, and bear the lash as well, and ain't I a woman? I have bore 13 children and seen most of them sold off to slavery, and when I cried out in my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me, and ain't I a woman? When they talk about this thing, what's that thing in the head? What they call it? Intellect. That's it, honey. What that got to do with a woman's rights, a Negro's rights? If my little cup won't hold but a pint and yours hold a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then, that man there, that little man in black there, he said, women can't have rights as much as men, 'cause Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Come from God and a woman. Man ain't had nothing to do with it. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back right side up again. And now they is asking to do it. The men better let them.
Okay, great. So that's quite a way to start. She's incredibly powerful. But you immediately see the difference between her and Frederick Douglass and his obsession with education and reading and writing in order to make a claim for rights. She's very quickly saying she's very clearly saying that that's not the case. Okay, so I think some of the things that that we're thinking about obviously have particular biases as we're picking up in our discussions. Some of them, I mean, there are obviously huge gaps in what we're covering. But, you know, in a way, it's trying to get us just to get into some questions around these issues we are grappling with. And I think it's rather a starting point than like an end point, and we should look at it in that way. One of the main gaps, I think, that often occur, not just in terms of this own session or even my own work generally, even my own teaching, there's this huge gap when it comes to women, all right? And this is present both from the radical politics to the conservative politics, okay? Women activists and intellectuals are often tended to be looked upon as add-ons. Like, we'll add on this struggle, we'll add on this woman issue. Oh, I've often sat in meetings where you're deciding a syllabus or inviting people to a conference, and you make the list, and we have too few women. Because outside of the very famous, important woman, like someone like Pumla Kola or something, who you'd have to invite, you're like, oh, we don't have any more women, and then you start adding, and you start looking, people start looking for the woman. Where are the women? Oh God, we don't have enough women, we have to have a woman here, we have to have a woman there. And so, you know, it's just really interesting the way in which that operates all the time, even in progressive spaces, and we need to be aware of that. And I think today what I'm going to do is talk more about that condition, about the way in which women have been marginalized, and then talk about the feminist struggles, and then talk about how black women within the feminist struggles have been marginalized. Black women have been marginalized in both the Pan-Africanist debates, and they've been marginalized in the feminist struggles. This does not mean that black women are not engaging in these debates. It does not mean that they're not thinking through it. It does not mean they're not thinking through key issues of our society, but they're usually marginalized. And one of the key things that often happens is that issues that women deal with often tend to be seen as issues of the home, especially poor women, especially black women. And that often seems to be seen as not political, that these aren't the political issues. Okay, and I remember a while ago when Marikana happened, there was a book that was done by, I think, Peter Alexander Center, and he came to present the book, and one of our students, actually all of us, asked him, like, where are the stories of the women, because they're women living in Marikana, they're wives of these people, they're partners, they're sisters, they're family members. He's like, oh no, but they want the workers. So they don't really count. They weren't throwing, girls really, he actually said girls really can't throw stones, which was a really problematic statement. But it was this idea that their work and their labor doesn't count. But when, some of our students went to do research, they found that women were absolutely involved in this. But it's like, oh no, but they were involved in issues at home. But those men going to the mine are also worried about sending their kids to school, about paying electricity bills, about putting food on the table. Why is their struggle then not seen as a struggle of home? It's seen as a workplace struggle. But everyone's working to do the same thing. So I think that these kinds of things really work in a way to discredit women. And bell hooks is really, we return to a few people repeatedly because, and while there's work being done, there's a lot of work being done around black women and around black feminism. Also on our continent, there's lots of stuff. There's fantastic work by people like Ife Amedu and so on. The bell hooks really begins to, and that movement from the 60s really begins to think about black women's role in all of this. And this is what she says about how black women are seen. And it's not just a purely instrumentalist way of analyzing, it's a very broad analysis. That's why it's so useful for women, because it's not just about how politics is defined narrowly. It's about the home, it's about the interior space, it's about love, it's about care, it's about a whole series of things that are being read as political, which we all know are. So basically this is what bell hooks says. Among those groups of women murdered as witches in colonial American society, black females have been historically perceived as embodying a dangerous female nature that must be controlled. More so than any group of women in this society, black women have been seen as all body and no mind. The use of black female bodies in slavery as incubators for the breeding of other slaves was the practical exemplification of the notion that the disorderly woman should be controlled. To justify white male sexual exploitation and rape of black females during slavery, white culture had to produce an iconography of black female bodies that insisted on representing them as highly sexed, the perfect embodiment of primitive, unbridled eroticism. Such representations impressed on everyone's consciousness the notion that black women were all body and no mind. Their cultural currency continues to inform how black females are perceived. They are seen as sexual signs. Black female bodies are placed in a category that, culturally speaking, is deemed far removed from the life of the mind. Within the sex-race class hierarchies in the United States, black women have always resided at the bottom. Low status is reserved in this culture for those who are deemed incapable of social mobility because they are perceived as sexist, racist, and classist, terms as deficient, inadequate, and inferior. Okay? And this is just talking very particularly about the United States, but we know this in our own history as well. It is always present. We have popular images continuously of black women as being, exotic, as highly sexualized, as primitive in their imaginings of them. Throughout the world, when black women are represented, it's often in these terms popularly. All right. You also find it very present in a variety of literature, in writing about black women. They're often seen in these terms. There's a whole, Edward Said, a very famous Palestinian scholar working on the ways in which the colonial system sets up ways of seeing the people of the Middle East. And this can be said to be the same of the continent. Someone like Sarah Bartman was a classic example of this. She was taken over to be displayed for her highly sexualized nature and her highly sexualized way of being. So this happens a lot. Even here, we haven't, you think in post-apartheid South Africa we would deal with some of these things. But I come from the Eastern Cape, unfortunately. I don't come from there, I live there now. But there's like tracts of land that's obviously been privatized and turned into game farms. And all of the advertising is all about this like empty lands with native peoples and animals. Like that's what is advertised. We didn't think to undo this and change it. And women are expected to, even in KwaZulu-Natal, appear in a particular way in the colonial imagination. That's how black women have to appear. And this is not incidental. It's not unimportant because it fits into the very ideas. These stereotypes then shape contemporary relationships of people in the workplace, intellectually, in activism, in a variety of places they get shaped. For example, I arrive to teach at, this obviously didn't happen in KwaZulu-Natal because, there's so many Indians there. So if someone asked me a question like that, it would have been ridiculous because people know some things about Indian people's lives, South African Indians' lives. But I arrived in Grahamstown and I was told, shame, it must be so terrible for you. Your life must have been so hard. You must have been so oppressed by your Indian father. Because this assumption that this is what Indian, Arab, those kinds of Eastern men do, is they oppress women and you're not allowed to be educated. And it's like the furthest thing from the truth in my life. In fact, I'm a bit more conservative than my father is. So it's like that entire basis of that, every time someone engaged with me, it was on questions of Indianness, which it's not something I'm an authority on. It's on questions of India. It's on these questions that I have very little to do with my own life. But it's shaped and mirrored through that. So the engagement is about that. I can't just be my own individual. And this happens to black women as a whole. Now, throughout history, we've seemed to have been able to overthrow dominant discourses, right? So we shouldn't underestimate how pervasive these discourses about women are. But the one discourse that kind of stays with us from, from early forms of Christianity to now is this idea of the mother or the whore, right? That women appear in these two ways. She's either the mother or she's the whore. It's like Mother Mary or the whore. Yeah, Magdalene. So it's these two binaries. And then, you know, colonialism uses this. In the colonial project, the whores were effectively the women of the colonized subjects, right? So wherever you were going, you know, whether it was Latin America, North America, Asia, Africa, the women were the whores. And the mothers who needed to be protected, the pure women, were the women of Europe. All right? And there's huge amount of work that goes into this project. And in fact, that is one of the key sort of legitimating factors of colonialism. It's the idea that we have to go in and we have to start worrying about all these people that exist in different parts of the world that are untamed, that have unbridled sexuality, and we need to start civilizing them. Because if they ever got a hold of our white women, it would be disastrous. And it got worse when white women were sent to settle in these colonies. That's when it became even worse. So colonialism, like slavery, happens in waves. The first wave is you send out men usually, and they're coming in to be like sort of, you know, just doing trading and sort of seeing what they can do. So it's usually around the British East India Company or the Dutch East India Company. So it's mercantile trading, right? And they come in. Eventually, when the movement of settlement begins, this is when there's a huge pressure in trying to control local populations that they encounter. They're trying to police them. That's when they try to get control of them. And one of the key legitimating aspects of this is the fact that white women are now present there. Okay? And for example, in India, one of the reasons why they send white women in the first place is they say that all these white men that are working for the British East India Company are arriving in India and they don't have women. And so they're forming relationships with these Indian women. And you know these Indian women, how highly sexualized and erotic they are, and devious with all their spicy food and what. I mean, literally, this is the discourse. This is how crazy and crass the discourse is. This is like, they're going to be infecting these men and changing them. So we need to now send white women to these colonies to keep up British ways, to keep up the pure Victorian ways of being. Right? So they send women. So they have these like they arrange marriages between women and men, white men in the colonies, and they send them over. And they come over to set up a proper civilized home. And so they bring in all of the sort of trappings of Europe into the colonized spaces. That's why even today, if you go to the Midlands in KwaZulu-Natal, there's people who have these houses that look like English twee cottages in like 40 degrees Celsius, and there's like coverings everywhere and all sorts of Victorian trappings so that they can recreate this, all right? And they were seen that was one of the key things that we had to protect. Slowly, as colonialism develops and it becomes more sophisticated, one of the key factors come into being is that we now have to also protect, because now you have to make an argument for subjugation of people. And one of the ways in which this is done is to say we need to also protect women, the black women, we also need to protect the black women, right, from the black men. The black men are the ultimate evil because they obviously also have huge unbridled, you know, all the stereotypes. Richard spoke about it last night with Fanon and so on. That they are this problem. And key legislation gets passed across the colonial world in regard to women that is about, the assumption is that we are protecting women from men. Right? And we're going to take them away from all these barbaric rights. So then they begin to start interfering in what they term traditional law, right? And that's how that whole idea of like traditional courts comes into being, this idea of, well, there's a different law for them and there's a different law for us, and that we will have to intervene within those spaces to make sure that women are protected from those men, from the very men that they live with in their communities. There's a very famous subaltern historian, Gayatri Spivak, a feminist as well. And she calls this, she says it's white men saving brown women from brown men, right? And this articulation becomes really important because when Spivak was writing this, she was writing it at the same time in the 70s when this whole black women feminism was really taking off. And it was actually in response to what she was seeing happening in the feminist movement in the US and in Europe, where black men were still vilified, but now it was white women saving black women from black men. So she kind of is writing this, she looks historically back into the past and says that this is a system that comes to us from the past and it stays with us till now. Okay, and so we have this during colonialism, but then this dichotomy remains with us, it doesn't stop. It's not like, so during the anti-colonial struggles, what the nationalists do, the anti-colonial nationalists, is they take on that same narrative of the mother and the whore. So instead of inverting it and saying we're just not having this whole situation, they also take it on. And this time, it's the mother of the nation. So black women now become mothers of the nation, right? And it's all those things, those conservative things. They will be at home, they will be breathing the nation, they'll be good wives, they'll be good mothers, they'll be good daughters. Okay? And if you fail from that, or if you fall from that, then just, you're smashed.
Winnie Mandela.
Yes, that's exactly who I'm thinking about, right? So you have Ma Winnie, who is a classic example. Ma Winnie is like mother of the nation, mother of the nation, mother of the nation. She doesn't fit in neatly to what people want of her, and she's out, right? I'm not saying that violence or anything that she does is in terms of what supposedly she did was excusable. The fact of the matter is lots of people did lots of things in the struggle. But she's dealt with differently. She's thought about differently. She's engaged with differently. As soon as she becomes inconvenient, as soon as she stops being the wife and the mother, she's then erased, actually taken out of the narrative. Okay? And this just continues. So why is it? And throughout history, and so this is not something that is just, when women speak about it or speak to it, or young women are continuously coming to you when you're teaching them, speaking about these issues, it's not some sort of, conspiracy. It's actually there. You can trace it historically through evidence, through very, very strong evidence. Okay? And we know that throughout history, there's been huge feminist movements, well, not feminist movements in the strict sense, but rethinking the role of women in society. Okay? We can go back to leaders such as Al-Kahina from North Africa, who was one of the key leaders in sort of repelling the invasion of the Persians into North Africa. We have Nzinga as well, who was key, and the way in which she took on the Portuguese state and ensured that her people had some independence. And they are interesting figures because they often show up. They challenge aspects of patriarchy, but at the same time they're not also challenging aspects of the patriarchy, and a lot of times fit into the mold of it. So we have to look through history, we have to sift through history for these women. But another place where there was actually a huge challenge to patriarchy outside of the modern period is within Islam. Right? Now, whenever I teach this to my students, they get completely shocked that there was anything progressive in Islam. All right? But Islam as a religion starts off as being incredibly progressive. The version of Islam that we have today, Wahhabism, which comes out about 100 years ago from a particular thinker, Wahhabi, in Persia, that version of Wahhabism is tied very deeply to nationalism and to the Saudi family, all right? And that version of Wahhabism is what we have today, which is very, it's cleansed of all what it sees as all its progressive aspects, right? Before this, you had Islam that was such a Sufism, which is deeply concerned about a variety of ethical, human issues, philosophical questions, and it was under that Islam that you had the classical golden period of Islam in the world, where mathematics and science, and in fact there's an argument that a lot of the work that comes from Europe during the Crusades, it comes back from the Persian world into Europe, and that's the kind of spark to get Europe out of the medieval period, is the sort of intellectual work and art and beauty and all of those things that they experience in the Middle East. Now, so Islam made huge strides in the 7th century in terms of reform of women's rights. Okay? And this included things around marriage, divorce, inheritance. All right? One of the key things that it stopped doing was female infanticide. Female infanticide is still a huge practice in India, for example, where in some villages no girl child's been born for 40 years. All right? So that's why in India you can't have, they don't have, what's that when you have a baby, scans? They don't scan you. Ultrasounds when you're pregnant. So it has to be done in very, very strict, under very strict terms, because people used to have ultrasound machines to see if they were having a girl child or a boy child, and then abort it if it was a girl child. So, you know, this is a really key thing that they did in terms of recognizing the full personhood of women. And within Islamic ethics and Islamic law, women, for example, in marriage is not an imperative, it's a contract. That's why you have to seek the permission of women in Islam before you get married to them. And that's why it's separate. The ceremonies are done separately. Men are at a separate venue and women. So there's no coercion of women to say yes to getting married. Okay? They completely abolished dowry. There was no bride wealth to be paid, which we still, in India, they still pay within Hinduism. And if there was, she had to retain it as her personal property. And very importantly, within Islam, women can inherit and could inherit property, which was not the case in Europe until like the last 120 years or something, and then to not always in full. So you know, we can see that there's been these constant contestations around the role of women in society for most of history. But generally the story goes, and we're going to kind of trace the story around feminism as a movement which begins in Europe. It can usually be traced back to the mid-18th century as a popular movement with the likes of people like Mary Wollstonecraft and so on. When the French Revolution occurred and you had the rights of man, Mary Wollstonecraft in 1792 published something called The Vindication of the Rights of Women. Okay? And so, you know, women were key to all of these struggles and the changing world that was happening. You know, the end of monarchy and the beginning of a new sort of republic coming into being. In fact, one of the key events of the French Revolution is the Women's March on Versailles, right? The October March. And you know, it's really significant because these women march and they start in the marketplaces in sort of retaliation against the very high prices that they're facing in terms of bread and so on. But they march all the way to Versailles, which is outside of Paris, and just sort of ransack this palace and, you know, put the fear of God into the queen and king. But it's not given. I mean, it's often, it is spoken about, but it's not spoken about as much. It's not as popularly known as, say, Bastille Day, for example, right? And Bastille Day was actually a complete failure. Outside of symbolism of smashing a building, there was no one even there. There were like 4 prisoners there. There wasn't even any, they had like abandoned it, right? But this is the big day that everyone celebrates. It's the big moment. And so people say, well, it was as significant as Bastille Day, but I would be like, no, it was much more. But because it was women, ordinary women who were just doing this thing, it doesn't get that same sort of, play or whatever, attention. Okay, and I think that, and then what happens is by the mid-1800s in Europe, especially in England, there's a lot of discussion around giving women the rights, especially now that people are beginning to have the right to vote and so on, because society's orders and structures have changed. There's a lot of discussion about the rights of women, but these remain very much a elite discourse. The elite women would sit around, have parlor gatherings, serve tea and so on, and talk about their rights, right? But they did not want those rights to extend to everyone. They were very clear that it was only them, the civilized woman, the educated woman, that could have these rights. However, there's one key thing that happens in England. You have the Contagious Disease Act of 1864. It's called the CD Acts, in short form. And the CD Acts, basically, there was a huge outbreak of venereal diseases in Victorian England, which is actually like quite ironic, considering you weren't supposed to have sex in Victorian England, but everyone has venereal diseases somehow. So obviously it was a lot of men were dying of syphilis. There was a huge outcry. So obviously those responsible for it must be women. You know, that's how society often works. It still works like that. Whenever there's diseases, whenever there's stuff happening in society, it's women that get tested. It's women's bodies. I mean, even for HIV/AIDS, giving birth means you have to get tested. You are going to be reproducing. It falls onto your body. That hasn't changed. So the idea was that effectively what would happen is if someone suspects that you might have a venereal disease as a woman, not as a man, you will get quarantined for 3 months for them to test you. Now, because this was happening, it could apply to women of any class. For the first time, then women from different classes had to come together and mobilize and work around something. Okay? And so this is really important, this moment, because, I mean, this doesn't mean that within the movement there was still no discrimination, but it meant that for the first time women had to mobilize as an entire collective in England to repeal this act. And then what happens is, you know, this kind of paves the way for what we know to be those early 20th century working class feminist struggles that are coming out of Europe, like the movie The Suffragette does. But once again, these movements, these stories are really, so they're now including women, and there are stories about women being told, but once again, these stories leave out someone. And the people they leave out of the narrative is black women, all right? And whenever you look at any representation or any sort of discussion or anything about when does black women feminism start? When do black women's struggle start? People usually date it to the 1960s. They usually say it starts around the civil rights movement in the United States. Now, we know this is incorrect because even in our own country, women have been struggling for a variety of things from, you know, more than 150 years ago. But this is the moment that people always talk about. Now, if we exclude, and so that's why when you make a movie like Suffragette or Suffrage or whatever it's called, you cannot have a single black woman in there because you can say, well, they just didn't exist. There were no black women. But if we just say, okay, fine, we'll take you on your word. There were no black women. And we will leave out the alternative ways of conceptualizing women's struggles. We leave out like religious figures. We leave out someone like Louisa Mbembe, who was a healer and a midwife from the turn of the century, from the turn of the 20th century in Southern Africa. We'd leave out, you know, our rain queens that we have. We'd leave out Nonkosa, whatever. We'd leave all those alternative ways of looking at women. We'd leave out the storytellers and the novelists. And we just take it on your terms, that women have not been part of the feminist struggle. And you will find that this is absolutely incorrect, okay? And Bell Hooks writes again, and I will just read this to you. It kind of like supports what I'm saying. She says here, despite the historical evidence that black women have always played a major role as teachers, critical thinkers, and cultural theorists in black life, particularly in segregated black communities, there's very little written about black female intellectuals. When most black folks think about great minds, they most often conjure up male images. Whenever I ask students to name black intellectuals without requesting that they be gender specific, they invariably name black men: Du Bois, Delaney, Garvey, Malcolm X. And even contemporary folks like Cornel West and Henry Louis Gates are mentioned. If I request that they be gender specific, they readily name these black men and hesitate as they mentally search for the names of famous black women. After much pause, they begin to call out the names of famous contemporary black woman writers, usually Alice Walker, Toni Morrison. Now and then Angela Davis's name appears on this list. They do not know the work of 19th century black woman intellectuals. Black woman critical thinkers who would be perfect counterparts to Du Bois and Delaney are not known. The name of Anna Julia Cooper and even the more widely circulated name of Ida B. Wells are not on the tip of everybody's tongue. Okay? And I think this is really important, that we need to now begin to tell these stories and repeatedly tell them. right? Some of us might know the stories, some of us might talk about these individuals. How many have heard about Ida B. Wells before this? Except Pindile. Has anyone else heard about Ida B. Wells? Okay. And Mary Church Terrell? Oh. And Anna Julia Cooper? Okay, 3, 4. You see? But everyone's obviously heard of W.E.B. Du Bois. All right? So, and Pankhurst? Emmeline Pankhurst? Yeah. Okay. So you see how what the state is of the situation, just even in this room, amongst people who want to think and learn and read and who are curious about these issues, right? How biased we are even in our own view. Okay, so I think what we're going to do now is, after I gave you all that long sort of dressing down, I'm going to talk about these women, right? I'm going to talk about Sojourner Truth and Ida B. Wells very specifically. And then in our discussion, we can talk about whoever else you'll want to ask me questions about, and we can unpack what this means and how this has been done. Okay, I'm speaking about Sojourner Truth very particularly because she was there at the very beginning in 1851 when people were talking about the rights for women. She was one of the key members of that struggle. Okay, but she's not ever read as one of the mothers of feminism. She's put into the ghetto of the slave thinker. Okay, and it's only in that way can she appear as someone who is interested in religion, as someone who is interested in saving her family, and someone has the freedom of the slaves, but not as someone who was actually challenging understandings of gender in such serious ways. Okay, because she was so far in advance to the sort of feminists that come later on, in the suffrage movement, who want women to be treated specially, or even the idea that women have some special better way of ruling or controlling. I mean, it's going to say, oh well, if we have a female president, everything will be great. You're like, yeah, Margaret Thatcher, Benazir Bhutto. Really, is that what we think is going to happen? You know, women don't have a special innate way. You know, we don't want to be mothers and goddesses and queens. We just want to be people. All right, and so this is what she was saying, and it actually was so radical for the moment, but she's just so written out of that narrative. Okay, so let me just tell you a bit about who she was. She was born, it's believed, around 1797, and her name was Isabella Baumfree. Once again, they had to take on the names of the slave owners, which was the practice. She was one of 12 children who were born to her family, and she was born in Ulster County, New York. Okay, her father was a slave captured in modern-day Ghana, and basically they lived on a plantation owned by a colonel called Hardenberg. And where she grew up, a lot of people still spoke Dutch in this part of the United States, and she herself could speak both Dutch and English. And then once the colonel died, the son took over the plantation, but soon after he died, and that was when the family was split up. Okay, and they were sent to different places. And Sojourner Truth was 9 years old, and at this time she was sold at an auction with a flock of sheep for $100. Okay, and then she was bought by a man called John Neely, and she said he was incredibly harsh and incredibly violent man. And then she was sold twice more after that in her life, and she eventually came to live and become the property of someone called John Dumont. Okay, and it was during these years living with the Dumonts that she really learned to speak English properly, and she fell in love with a slave in the nearby farm, and because and they had 2 children together, but because they were property and people did not know how to divide property, slaves were not encouraged to fall in love and not encouraged to have children and start families, because then how are you going to divide the property, especially if it is between different plantations, right? And then what happened was she and Robert had to split up, and then she had to get married to another slave, at the behest of her owner, he decided who she was to marry, and it was someone from within his plantation. So then the property of the children that she produces becomes his property, and no one else has claim over them. Right. And then eventually in 1799, the state of New York passed a legislation to abolish slavery. And they said by 1824, so it was the process to abolish slavery, by 1824, everyone will be freed. Everyone should be freed. This was in New York, in the North. Okay, and then Dumont promised to free Sojourner Truth, but by the time it came for him to free her in 1824, he changed his mind. And in 1826, Sojourner then escaped with her infant daughter Sophia, and she couldn't take the rest of her children, and they were sold into slavery down into the South. And so she escaped, and she went to live with a Quaker family, Van Wagenen, and it was with them that she basically was able to get her emancipation through their help, and them taking Dumont to court. And while she had got her freedom, she realized that her son Peter was sold into slavery and was sent down to Alabama. And so with the assistance of the Van Wagens, she took the trip down to the South and took the United States government to court. And she was the first woman in history who won a case. Okay? And she had her son freed. Right? So he was granted his freedom, and then he became a sailor. So he worked on whaling ships, and unfortunately she lost contact with him later on. During her stay with the Van Wagens, she became a very devout Christian, and she joined a variety of churches in New York. And in June 1843, she changed her name to Truth, Sojourner Truth, and she also became a Methodist Christian. And she said that her name, Sojourner Truth, was really important because she's going to be traveling and going on this journey telling the truth. And so it included talking about the experience of slavery, talking about oppression, talking about feminism, but also very importantly, it was about talking about Christianity, because for her that was vital to the liberation of people. And it was also during this time that she met people like Frederick Douglass and joined the abolitionist movement and so on. And once again, she was asked by this group of abolitionists to write her story down. And so she dictated the story, and it was written down by William Lloyd Garrison and published in 1850. And like the earlier books, it also became incredibly famous. And she then becomes a key person within the feminist struggle, and she basically moves to Chicago, where she spends the rest of her life. Sojourner Truth was an incredibly popular speaker, and so she was like called all across the country to speak continuously until her death in 1883. But she was very different to another, at the time, incredibly famous ex-slave woman, Phyllis Wheatley. Now, Phyllis Wheatley was really interesting because she was giving her independence from a much younger age, and she was a house slave, and she had learned to read and write, and she was incredible. She wrote incredible poetry, and that was really encouraged by the people who owned her and who had then given her her freedom. So she kind of lived as an adopted child of this family, and her approach to slaves being free was very conservative, okay? And it was very different to Sojourner Truth. It was about people becoming educated, people becoming civilized, and once they reach that particular state, then they should be given their independence, that they're not ready for their independence. Now, these debates aren't unusual to us. We know that even within our own country, people have had these debates about when people should be given independence and when they shouldn't be given independence. So it's interesting to see these splits continuously, and it does fall a lot along class lines, and that's something we need to take very seriously. And why is that the case? Okay, the second person I'm just going to just briefly talk about quickly before we get to the questions is Ida B. Wells. Okay, she is incredibly famous. Well, not obviously that famous, but very well known. She was a journalist. She was a newspaper editor. She was a socialist, and she was one of the key early leaders of the civil rights movement. All right, and she also, like I've said, I think 2 days ago, was that she was a Georgist. Right, Georgists follow the economic policy that everything that is natural should be held in trust, and what you produce from yourself you can make a profit of. And these were kind of the sort of economic philosophies and policies that she would try and put in place and try and pursue and promote within these movements for Africans to become free. One of the key things she's incredibly famous for doing is documenting all of the lynchings that happened in the United States. And she says that these lynchings were a way to punish blacks who competed with the whites, blacks who did not know their place, right? And she took this very seriously. And while she was a feminist and a suffragist, she understood that the condition of blacks and poor people were also absolutely important. And so she became a key critic of feminism, right? And so here's a feminist who's a key critic of all of this stuff, operating from around, very famous in like the 1880s, right up until the 1920s, 1930s, but he's completely left out of the story of the suffrage, right? It's completely left out of the story. And for her, her main thing was that the suffragette movement, as it was, and the white feminist movement, only were concerned with white women's rights. They weren't concerned with the idea of rights generally, right? And this is very different to Sojourner Truth. The white feminists, you find that this line of being concerned with rights generally and not just with a particular group is a radical thing that goes back in these women movements. Sojourner Truth was the same. She wasn't interested in rights only for a particular group. She was interested in rights for everyone. Frederick Douglass, whatever his limitations were, was interested in rights for everyone. He says it's useless that he get the right to be free if women are not given the right to be free. Yet, these women were still very much concerned for their own rights and incredibly conservative as well. And so she takes them on a lot in the United States. And then in 1894, she visits England, Great Britain. This is the second time she visits it. And she's going there to really speak about and highlight what's happening to black women, to black people with lynchings in the United States. And it's here that she goes to work for, she becomes a sort of correspondent for the Daily Inter-Ocean newspaper. And she's the first black woman to be a correspondent for a mainstream white newspaper. And she then, goes on a speaking tour, and she talks about what was happening and the variety of lynchings that were happening. And people were incredibly shocked to learn about this. But at the same time that she was there talking about these lynchings, another individual was visiting the United States. Her name was Frances Willard. And she was part of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Now, I have a whole lot of issues with temperance people because I like to drink alcohol. So just, on that level, I don't like them. Yeah.
There's too much boozing.
So on just on that level, I don't like her already. But she really. She comes in and she's seen as this, she's seen as the uncrowned queen of American democracy. She's so concerned about all these things. But she actually told women in the South, her temperance union, not to organize with black women, right? She actually said that we can only have segregated organization and that we should not be concerned with the issues of the Negroes. And so, while she was in the UK, Ida B. Wells took her on and wrote a very sort of public attack on her, and said that she had said, this is what she had said when she was talking about her temperance movement and when she was trying to pass legislation. She said the reason why we have a problem with too much of drinking is black people, because they drink too much. all right? And she says here, the colored race multiplies like locusts of Egypt. The grog shop is its center power. The safety of women, of childhood, of home is menaced in 1,000 localities, all right? And so she actually called for an attack on the Negro population of the South and a sort of closing down of their rights. And Ida B. Wells took her on very seriously, all right? And she then, and when she returned to the United States, because she had taken on Frances Willard so publicly, she really suffered for this, and she was really marginalized within a variety of movements, okay? While we have Ida B. Wells, we also have another key feminist thinker of the period, Anna Julia Cooper, all right? And she was an author, she was a teacher, and she was also an incredibly, she received a PhD from Sorbonne in 1924, and she was the fourth African American woman to receive a doctorate, all right? And she started her own school that she ran. She was very close to a variety of people, including W.E.B. Du Bois and so on. So she was quite central in this intellectual movement in the United States. She was born into slavery, but was freed when slavery ended. And she studied through receiving scholarships because she was extremely distinguished student. But not only did she do this in terms of, you know, being an African black woman, she also was really amazing just in terms of women. Because a lot of the schools that she attended, men were encouraged, because they were schools that poor people usually attended because it was scholarship based, they were encouraged to go into the church, right, and become religious scholars. And she actually challenged that and won, that she could study something else and study more of the analytical disciplines. And so she studied maths, science, Latin, French, ancient Greek, and so on. And she didn't do what was called the lady courses. So she rejected that, and she actually won the right to do that, when other women, white women even, did not have the right to do that. I mean, I don't know, when we were young, we used to have to do typewriting at school, and home economics and typewriting. Yeah, we don't have that anymore, thank God, but we used to have to do that. But one of the key things that she did was she gave the keynote address at the World Congress of Representatives for Women in Chicago in 1893. And she was also one of the key speakers at the Pan-African Congress in London in 1900. And the paper she spoke about was the Negro problem in America, all right? And so she was another key person. Also, she was very fundamental in the development of the Pan-African network. And she worked behind the scenes and did a lot of that work that women still do, the organizational work, all right? And are often not credited or often not seen. And that work is not seen. So I think I'd just leave it there for now, but we have a lot to think about and talk about moving forward.